With the bonfire lit, the story begins. Chupa Cabra, the shadow of the night. Based on a true story. In the year 1995, a wave of mystery and terror began to haunt farms and rural communities. Animals were found dead, drained of blood, with strange holes in their necks. Privacy, initially restricted to Puerto Rico, soon spread to several countries, leaving a trail of fear and doubts. Could it be an unknown beast? An out-of-control scientific experiment? Or something even more terrifying to hope in the darkness? The investigation of a skeptical journalist and a researcher obsessed with the supernatural leads them to a disturbing truth that defies logic and puts their own lives at risk. The night was darker than usual when Miguel Torres left his wooden house in the interior of Puerto Rico to check if his dogs were barking incessantly. The smell of wet earth filled his nostrils, and the air was heavy, as if a storm was coming. Miguel, an experienced rancher, had seen it all. Coyote attacks, snakes wrapped around the chicken coop, even livestock thefts. But that night, something was different. There was a silence between the barks, a strange vacuum in the atmosphere, as if nature itself existed in the breath. When he arrived at the goat pen, his heart stopped for a second. What he saw was worse than any nightmare he had ever had. 5 of his best goats were killed, lying on the ground as if they had been left there lifeless. The strange thing was the state of the bodies. There were no signs of struggle, no carcass torn apart as in common attacks. However, they all had 2 circular puncture wounds on their necks, and the blood had simply disappeared. Miguel knelt down next to one of the animals and ran his hand through its dew-enchanted fur. It was freezing. He looked around, feeling the back of his neck tingle. Anything you noticed? Their dogs were still growling at the dense brush surrounding the farm. He swallowed hard and ran into the house. The next day, news was reported by the neighborhood that something was killing the animals. The local newspaper sent a reporter to cover the case. Carolina Mendez was young, ambitious, and full of adrenaline. It didn't take long to realize that this case was not a common occurrence. When he arrived at Miguel's farm, the sight of the bodies made him step back for a second. He'd covered brutal crime stories before, but he'd never seen anything so meticulous and strange. No signs of struggle, no footprints, just those holes. In the neck and the blood completely drained. She wondered what kind of creature could cause that. That same night, while Carolina was reviewing her notes in a small hotel in the region, she received a call from an anonymous contact. The voice on the other end was hoarse, almost shaky. "You don't know you're not getting involved. This is no ordinary attack. They are hunting, and I won't stop." Before I could ask anything, the line went dead. The phone has become dirty. Outside, the wind began to blow strongly, and Carolina had the strange feeling that someone was watching her. Carolina. Mendez couldn't sleep that night. The anonymous phone call echoed in his mind, and the strange sensation of being watched prevented him from closing his eyes. When it finally dawned, she decided to return to Miguel Torres's farm to seek more information. Upon arrival, I found a different scene. 2 local police officers were in the corral, taking photos and listlessly taking notes. They seemed disinterested, as if they were just there for protocol. "That was an attack by coyotes or some wild animal," said one of the police officers with a bored look. "These farmers like to exaggerate." Miguel, still shaken by the loss of his animals, was elated. "Have you ever seen coyotes sugaring goat's blood without leaving a drop on the ground? I've lived here for years and have never seen anything like this." The officer snorted, closing his notebook. "Look, Mr. Torres, I've seen stories like this before. Tomorrow or the day after, you will forget about it and move on." But not everyone wanted to ignore it. A group of residents began to gather at the farm. There was something different on their faces, an expression of fear and recognition. A lady with gray hair and a distressed look holds Carolina's arm. "I saw it, girl. I saw something that did that." Silence took over the group. "What did you see?" asked Carolina, feeling a shiver run up her spine. The woman swallowed hard and looked around as if afraid that something or someone was listening. A creature. Tall, thin, with large, worn eyes. She moves like a shadow, silent. I saw her on the road very close to here, and she wasn't alone. The murmur among the residents increased. Others began to tell their own stories. Figures in the bush, strange. Noises at night, animals disappearing without explanation. But the scariest detail was always the same, the description of the creature. Carolina felt butterflies in her stomach. Something much bigger than a simple animal attack was happening. But was it true? Because the authorities were so interested in closing the case? As she prepared to leave, a boy moved away from her and held her hand. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I saw one last night, miss. He was standing in my yard." And he saw me too. Carolina's heart raced. The fear was not confined to the islands of Puerto Rico. Weeks after the first attacks, similar reports emerged in Dominican Republic. Farmers in the interior began to find their animals dead in the same disturbing way. Punctures in the neck, no blood, and no signs of struggle. The stories spread like wildfire, whispered among people who avoided going out at night. In a remote village called San Juan de la Maguana, farmer Esteban Morales woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of his dogs barking furiously. He took his flashlight and went out armed, fearing thieves. But what he found made his blood run cold. Not fenced where he kept his goats, the animals were dead, their bodies rigid, the identical marks that were described in Puerto Rico newspapers. The smell of iron in the air was thick and nauseating. But that wasn't the worst. High up in a nearby tree, two large red lights glowed in the dark. Esteban froze. His heart was beating so hard that he felt the blood pounding in his ears. He knew that this was no ordinary animal. A creature appears there for a few seconds, analyzing him with empty, hypnotic eyes, and then, like a blur of shadows, disappeared into the forest. The case soon reached the attention of Ethan Parker, an American journalist for the Miami Herald, specializing in investigations of unexplained specifications. Skeptical by nature, Ethan frequently traveled to Latin America in search of bizarre cases, only to debunk them later. But there was something different about these reports. They were too consistent, repetitive, and spread frighteningly quickly. Ethan flew to Santo Domingo and, with the help of a local colleague, began gathering witnesses. Each account seemed to echo the one before, a tall, skeletal bipedal creature with elongated eyes and an insatiable hunger for blood. He interviewed Esteban Morales, who was still shaking as he recounted his experience. "I know what I saw," said the farmer, his voice wavering. "That wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a wolf. That thing, it looked at me, Mr. Parker, and he wasn't human." Ethan wrote down every detail, but what caught his attention most was an unexpected piece of information. They say that some in the government already knew this was going to happen, but they don't want us to talk about it. The phrase kept ringing in Ethan's head as he drove back to the hotel. I was used to conspiracy theories, but this time something seemed different. While reviewing your notes in the room, notice that one of the notable witnesses is a specific name, Carolina Mendez, journalist from Puerto Rico. Ethan felt a shiver. Whatever was happening, it seemed to be growing like a dark storm crossing the Caribbean. He wanted to know why. News about the attacks spread like a virus. What once seemed like an isolated isolation in the Caribbean was now advancing on an unpredictable path. First Puerto Rico, then the Dominican Republic, and now the farms in the north of Mexico were reporting the same macabre pattern. Dead animals with punctures in the neck, no blood, and no trace of the predator. The most alarming case occurred on a small property in the state of Tamaulipas, near the Texas border. The farmer, Javier Ramirez, agreed to the deafening noise of his chickens screaming. He grabbed his spike and ran outside, only to be faced with a scene that would make him question everything he knew. Their herds of goats were dead, bodies stiff from the early morning cold, eyes wide in a frozen expression of terror. The scariest thing was the feeling that something was still there. At the top of a wooden barn, Javier saw a silhouette. Two long, slender legs, eyes extended, reflecting the moonlight, thorns emerging from the spine. He couldn't move. Time seemed to stop. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature leapt to the ground without making a sound, disappearing into the shadows of the desert. The next morning, the local newspapers found alarming headlines. The Chupa Cabra arrives in Mexico. Supernatural creature or government experiment. Speculation took over the region. Some believed the creature was a demonic entity, an omen of a greater kind. Others said it was a military experiment that escaped from a secret laboratory. But there were those who believed in something even more sinister. It was no ordinary monstrosity. It was something that was migrating, seeking an unknown purpose. Panic increased when nearby farms reported identical sightings. Some witnesses swore they saw figures move too fast to be human. Others said that the lights of their houses flickered moments before the attacks, as if an electromagnetic field surrounded a creature. Ethan Parker, the American journalist, wasted no time. As soon as the first reports emerged from Mexico, he caught a flight and headed for the border. His instinct told him this was more than an urban legend. When he arrived at the village, he interviewed Javier Ramirez, who, still trembling, described the monstrosity in detail. "I've never felt so scared in my life," said Javier, holding the cross on his chest. "It looked at me, but it wasn't. Like a wild animal. It was like he was studying me." The journalist noted every detail, noticing a pattern. If a creature, it was not a common predator. Then, what exactly did she want? That night, Ethan stayed at a simple inn. As he reviewed his notes, he felt a chill run down his spine, the feeling of being watched. He looked out the window, nothing, just the dry desert wind blowing against the old wood of the house. But when he turned to turn off the light, he saw something. Your laptop screen was flickering by itself. And then, right in the middle of the screen, a single sentence appeared typed on the notepad, as if someone or something were trying to communicate with him. "You are too close. Get out while you can." Fear had already taken hold in rural communities in northern Mexico, but not everyone was willing to hide. Hector Salgado, an experienced hunter from the region of Coahuila, didn't believe in legends. For him, everything had a logical explanation, but that changed when his younger brother, Thomas, was found dead on the outskirts of the family farm. The scene was identical to the previous cases. 2 puncture wounds to the neck, total absence of blood, and no sign of struggle. However, there was something different that night. Tomas was not an animal. He was a man. Local authorities ruled out any supernatural possibility, claiming that Tomas's death could have been caused by a group of drug dealers or even a coyote attack. But Hector knew one truth. His brother was strong, agile, and knew those terrains better than anyone. There was no way an ordinary predator could have killed him like that. Overcome with fury, he took his 12-gauge shotgun, silver ammunition, for pure symbolism, and left for the desert. If something was hunting the people of that region, he would be the hunter this time. For 2 days, Hector made strange trailing sounds on the ground, thin, elongated footprints, which mysteriously disappeared at certain points. He found animal carcasses in the sand, all with the same marks on their necks. But what terrified him most was the silence. On the 3rd night, he set up camp in a small gorge, waiting for a creature to return to attack. The dry wind cut into his skin, and his only companion was the crackling fire. He was ready for anything, or at least thought to be. Around 3 the morning, a strange noise echoed through the canyon. Something was there. Hector held tight to his gun and aimed into the darkness. Then he saw it, 2 red lights, like embers, floating in the middle of the darkness. His instincts screamed to run, but he stood firm. Whatever it was, it didn't move like an animal. He was tall, thin, and seemed to merge with the night. Hector fired, the sound of the rifle court's deadly silence. But when the dust settled, there was nothing. He turned his body quickly, feeling the presence behind him, but it was too late. The next day, his truck was found abandoned in the middle of the desert. The engine was still hot. The shotgun was lying on the passenger seat, but there was no sign of Hector. Just a mark on the ground, 2 elongated footprints that started next to the vehicle and disappeared into nothingness. The news of the disappearance quickly revealed itself, and when it reached the ears of Ethan Parker, the American journalist, discovered that he was no longer just investigating a story. He was dealing with something much bigger than he imagined. News of the attacks was not restricted to Mexico. In the early 2000s, the same terrifying stories appeared to emerge in Texas, more precisely in small rural communities close to the border. Farmers woke up in the early hours of the morning to the desperate barking of their dogs, only to find their livestock dead, drained of blood and with identical perforations in the neck. The case gained prominence in the local media when William Carter, a respected biologist at the University of Texas, was called in to analyze the animals' bodies. Carter, a fervent skeptic, believed that this was just a case of attacks by known predators, perhaps coyotes or even vampire bats, common in the region. He would never have imagined that this investigation would call into question everything he believed in. When he arrived at the first affected farm, Carter found the animals' bodies still fresh. He took his gloves and carefully examined the wounds. The farmer who accompanied him, Joe Hawkins, he watched everything with his arms crossed, his face full of concern. "So, doctor, have you found any rational explanation for this?" asked Joe impatiently. Carter frowned. He expected to see irregular wounds, torn bites, signs of struggle, but there was none of that. The punctures were clean, precise, as if something had penetrated the skin without causing collateral damage. Furthermore, when tissue samples were found, something even stranger was noticed. The muscles more rigid than normal, as if there was some kind of paralysis before death. "That doesn't make sense," Carter muttered to himself. That night, he took some samples to his makeshift laboratory in a small trailer. For hours, he analyzed the tissues and the few residues found in the wounds. What he discovered made his heart race. Had traces of an unknown chemical compound, something that it did not resemble snake venom, nor did it resemble toxins from known animals. If it wasn't something natural, what could it be? Before you could continue your analysis, you heard a strange noise outside. His heart stopped for a moment. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the trailer door. The ranch was plunged into absolute darkness. The generator had failed. On the horizon, something moves. Long, distorted shadows, as if the desert itself was coming to life. And then, 2 red dots glowed in the dark, watching him. William Carter. The man of science finally understood why those farmers were so afraid. William Carter closed the trailer door with a bang and held his breath. That thing was out there. He was never a superstitious man, but something inside him screamed at him not to open that door again. Slowly, he turned off the interior lights and grabbed his thermal camera, a piece of equipment he used to track wildlife in his research. When he pointed the lens into the darkness, his blood ran cold. A humanoid shape was standing a few meters away, but the camera was not picking up any heat. That was impossible. Any living creature should emit some level of thermal radiation, but that was a cold hole in reality. On instinct, Carter picked up the phone and tried calling the local police. No signal. The generator failed, the power was out, and now his cell phone wasn't working either. He was completely isolated. It was then that the noise stopped. The silence was almost scarier than the noises. Carter waited, motionless, for long minutes. When he finally worked up the courage to look out the window again, the thing had disappeared. The next morning, he wasted no time. He drove to a neighboring town and gained access to one of the bodies of the dead animals. With the farmer's permission, he took it to an improvised laboratory at the university for further analysis. If no one believed him, he would at least have concrete proof. The first observations were shocking. Blood is not just drained. It seemed that every blood cell drained sugar without a trace. Furthermore, muscle fibers showed signs of unusual degeneration, as if something had paralyzed the animal before death. But the scariest revelation came when Carter made a deeper cut into the skin. Inside the fabric there were small metallic particles, microscopic, embedded as if they were fragments of a specific compound. It does not transmit to any known natural predator. Carter began taking photos and documenting everything. This discovery would change everything. He got in touch with someone in the government, with a renowned scientist. But before you could do anything, the laboratory door was broken down. 2 men in dark suits hiding. Carter barely had time to react before one of them grabbed him by the arm and pressed him against the table. "You got yourself into the wrong place, Professor." The second man began destroying his equipment. Hard drives were crushed. Tissue samples were burned with a portable blowtorch. Carter's notes were torn up as if they had never existed. When he tried to protest, one of the men whispered something in his ear that left him paralyzed. "That's not a predator. This is not an experiment. It's a sign, and we can't let people know." Before leaving, one of them threw a photo on the table. Carter's eyes widened when he saw what it was. A grainy image, taken by a military satellite, showing a creature identical to the one he saw the night before. But the most terrifying thing was the place where the photo was taken. Area 51. When Carter regained consciousness, he was alone in the destroyed laboratory. All traces of his research have been erased. There was nothing left but the photo. His rational, logical world had been shattered. What he spent his life denying was now real. The only person who might have answers was a journalist who had been investigating this case for years. Your next destination? Puerto Rico. The flight of William Carter for Puerto Rico. It was tense. He was no longer just a scientist, looking for answers. Now he was a marked man. After the attack on his laboratory, he knew that there were hidden forces that wanted to keep that secret buried. Every person at the airport seemed like a threat. Every glance exchanged was suspicious. His heart raced whenever a security officer passed by. He carried the only evidence that remained, an enigmatic photo of the creature taken by a military satellite in Area 51. From the truck, I took a taxi straight to a discreet cafe in the center of San Juan, where I arranged to meet with Carolina Mendez, a journalist who had been following the attacks in Puerto Rico. Carolina was waiting at a table in the back, wearing sunglasses and a cap to avoid being recognized. As soon as Carter sent it, she got straight to the point. "What did you discover?" He took the crumpled photo from his pocket and slid it across the table. Carolina took it and was silent for a few seconds, so I headed straight for Carter. "Do you have any idea what is safe?" The scientist agrees. "This means that this creature is not just a rural legend. Someone knows exactly what she is, and is hiding the truth." Carolina took a deep breath and took some dough from her bag. I also found something. She opened the folder, revealing copies of documents provided which they obtained through an anonymous source within the Puerto Rican government. There was military reports, records of unexplained disappearances, and something even more disturbing. A memo dated 1975, mentioning a secret operation called Project Eclipse. This document was written 20 years before the first Chupa. "Attacks were officially recorded," said Carolina, pointing to a note in the footer. "If the government knew something since the 1970s, that means these attacks are not new. A creature may have been among us for much longer than we imagine." The conversation was interrupted when Carolina received a message from an unknown number on her cell phone. "Stop now, you are being watched." His heart raced. He looked around the cafe, trying to find anyone who was paying attention to them, but no one seemed suspicious. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "They know we're too close, Carter." The scientist nodded, his jaw working. "And if they are threatening us, it means we are not on the right path." That night, Carolina and Carter decided to change hotels to avoid being tracked. But even so, around 3 in the morning, Carolina woke up to a noise in the hallway. Slow, calculated steps, stopping exactly at the bedroom door. She held her breath and looked through the peephole. There was someone there, but he was no ordinary man. The shadow on the other side of the door was thin, skeletal, and too tall for a human. Carolina felt cold terror run down her spine. His instinct screamed not to make any noise. And then the footsteps began to slowly move away. When he finally mustered the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. Just one piece of paper, folded on the floor. She took it with shaking hands and opened it. There were only 3 words written by hand. There is no escape. While Carolina and Carter dealt with dark threats in Puerto Rico, on the other side of the continent, in New Mexico, a team of night hunters was about to record something that would change everything. Derek Holloway, leader of the group, was an ex-soldier who dedicated himself to tracking down certain inexplicable things. He didn't believe the urban legends, but recent reports from farmers in the southwestern United States piqued his interest. Attacks were becoming frequent, always leaving the same pattern of bodies drained of blood and perfect marks on the neck. That night, his team set traps at an abandoned ranch outside of Roswell, a city already famous for its links with the paranormal. They brought thermal cameras, motion sensors, and even drones equipped with night vision. The goal was simple. If something was hunting on those lands, they would register. For hours, the radio was silent. The only sound was the sharp wind blowing through the dry bushes. But around 3:24 a.m. the first alert appeared. Movement captured 200 meters from the base. Something big, warned one of the team members over the radio. Derek took out his thermal camera and aimed it in the direction of the alert. Which didn't make sense. A humanoid shape, but with the wrong proportions. Too tall, too thin. Its body heat seemed to fluctuate in unstable waves, as if the creature itself was distorting the temperature around it. "My God," inspired one of the hunters. Before I could react, the motion sensor exploded with activity. Something was running towards them, too fast. The radio became full of static, flashlights flickered, and the drone flying overhead suddenly dropped, as if an electromagnetic wave had cut off its signal. It was then that Derek saw it with your own eyes. The creature was less than 50 meters away. 2 red eyes glowed in the darkness, observing them intelligently. But the thing cannot be attacked immediately. She just stared at them, as if studying their reactions. Derek hid his camera and started filming. He wasn't going to let this go without trying. But as soon as his lens caught a creature, the camera's display filled with interference, as if something was trying to erase the recording in real time. This is not natural. He found one of the hunters pointing his gun. The moment of tension lasted seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then, without warning, a creature disappeared in an impossible leap, disappearing into the desert like a living shadow. Silence returned, but no one moved. The fear was still there, stuck to the skin like cold sweat. Derek ran to check the camera. The video was distorted, but one frame captured the silhouette of the creature before it disappeared. He knew this was proof that what he was hunting in the desert was not of this world. But before he could get out of there, the radios screeched again, and amidst the static, a whispered voice. "You shouldn't have seen that." Derek Holloway wasted no time. As soon as the team returned to the city, he saved the video on multiple devices, fearing that something or someone would try to erase it. But before he could release the images, an unexpected email arrived in your inbox. The sender was unknown, and the subject of the message simply said, "You need to know the truth." The body of the email contained a location and time, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Albuquerque at 2 a.m. There was also a single attachment, an old, grainy photo of something that looked an awful lot like a creature he saw the night before. But what was most disturbing was the date marked in the corner of the image, 1952. Even though he knew it could be a trap, Derek decided to go to the meeting. He took with him a hidden recorder and a small revolver in case he needed to defend himself. Upon arriving at the warehouse, I met an old man, wearing a trench coat and a hat, who looked nervous. "Are you Holloway?" said the stranger with a hoarse voice. Derek agrees. The man handed him a brown envelope, his hands shaking. "They'll kill me if they find out I gave this to you." Before Derek could ask anything, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, as if he had never been there. Back at the hotel, Derek opened the envelope with anxious fingers. Inside it, there was a set of documents stamped with official U.S. government seals, some so old they were yellowed and fragile. He started reading, and with each page he turned, his heart beat faster. The documents detailed a highly classified military operation called Project Eclipse, which investigated sightings of unidentified creatures since the 1940s. But the scariest part came at the end of the dossier. Roswell Military Base. July 1952 registration of non-human biological entity captured in U.S. territory. Classification: hostile behavior, highly intelligent predator. Status: transferred to specific facilities for study and containment. Note: potential non-terrestrial origin or failed genetic experiment. Attention: it should not be revealed to the public. Derek felt cold sweat run down his forehead. The government has known this for decades, but the most recent document, dated 1995, made his stomach turn. Activity observed in Puerto Rico. Potential containment failure. Send team to stifle incidents. The Puerto Rico attacks, they were not the beginning of the story. They were the restart of something much older. Derek picked up the phone and called the only person who could help him decipher these documents. Hours later, Ethan Parker answered on the other end of the line. "I found something great. You need to see this. There was just one problem. Someone was already after him." The moment he hung up, his hotel room was invaded by two men in dark suits. Derek tried to react, but a syringe was pressed against his neck. Your vision went dark, and the last thing you caught before losing consciousness was a cold voice whispering, "You went too far." The darkness was absolute. Derek Holloway opened his eyes with difficulty, feeling his head pound as if he had been hit by a truck. His mouth was dry, and the smell of mold and rusty metal permeated the air around him. Where the hell was he? I tried to move, but found that was tied to a metal chair in a poorly lit room. Fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting distorted shadows on the concrete walls. The coldness of the environment suggested that he was somewhere in bunker. A door opened with a long, agonizing creak. Two men in suits entered, followed by a third figure, an elderly man wearing a white coat. He had a tired but refined look, like someone who had spent his life hiding secrets that haunted him. "Mr. Holloway went too far," said the old man, pulling out a chair to sit in front of him. "And now you need to know the truth." Derek tried to speak, but his throat was dry. One of the agents handed him a glass of water. He drank in a hurry, his mind still confused, trying to understand if this was a threat or something worse. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. The old man sighed and slid a new brown envelope on the table between them. "My name doesn't matter. But what's inside that envelope could change everything you think you know about Chupacabra." Derek opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a confidential report dated 1970, signed by a U.S. Air Force colonel. The opening words were already a punch in the gut. "Classified incident. Operation Black Star, location Amazon rainforest, Brazil." Derek frowned. Brazil? What would Chupacabra have to do with this? He continued reading and felt a shiver run down his spine. Reconnaissance team sent for multiple investigation of missing people in the rural region of Amazonas. Reports from residents describe a nocturnal predator of large stature, elongated eyes, and sharp claws. Bodies of animals and humans found with holes in the neck, absence of blood, and signs of paralysis before death. The report was eerily identical to the cases Derek had been investigating. The creature was active at least 25 years before the first official case in Puerto Rico. "This doesn't make sense," Derek murmured. "If this case happened in the 70s, why have we never heard about it?" The old man leaned forward, his gaze filled with a heavy truth. "Because we erase history." Derek continues reading the documents and discovers something even worse. The 1970 case was not just investigated, he was content. The mentioned that the government captured a live specimen of the creature in the Amazon. He was taken to a secret facility in the USA for study, but escaped. A creature missing for decades until it reappeared in Puerto Rico in 1995, stronger and more lethal than before. "You knew what you were celebrating this whole time," Derek whispered, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The old man nodded. "And now, it is evolving." Derek feeling his breathing. If that was true, then Chupacabra wasn't just a legend. It was something much older and more deadly than anyone could imagine. And now he knew too much. Derek Holloway left that facility with more questions than answers. Now I knew that Chupacabra was older than previously thought, that the government was trying to capture him, and that something had gone terribly wrong. But why now? What had triggered these new attacks? I needed more information. If a creature had already been seen in the 70s, then there would be witnesses who were still alive. It was then that he found a name in one of the secret reports. Mateo Ibarra Mateo was an elderly resident of a remote village in the Peruvian Amazon, and his name appeared linked to the 1970 incident. At the time, he was just an 8-year-old child. His family lived in a small community of rubber tappers, and somehow he survived the attack that decimated almost all of the village's residents. Derek took the first flight to Peru. His search led him to an isolated settlement in the forest, where he found Mateo, now a man of 70 with an empty look and deep scars on his soul. "Are you one of them?" Mateo asked suspiciously when Derek was introduced. "No, I just want to know what happened. I want to understand the truth." Mateo analyzed him for a moment, then assigned him to a wooden chair on the porch of his house. So I started telling his story. I was just a kid, but I never forgot. That night, Mateo began, his voice low, sharing dark memories. He said that his village was used to the dangers of the forest, jaguars, snakes, forest spirits. But what came that night was no ordinary animal. The dogs became more desperate. His father and other men grabbed machetes and flashlights and went out to see what was happening. Then the scream came. It was not a human scream, Mateo said, looking at the floor. It was something different, something that chilled me to the bone. He hid under the bed when he was shot. But the shots didn't last long. When I finally arrived, I saw the village plunged into chaos. The bodies were scattered on the floor, pale, without blood, eyes open, frozen in the last moment of terror. And then he saw the creature. She was tall as a large man, but thin, skeletal. The eyes glowed in the dark like a cat's, but red. And she saw me. Mateo swallowed second. She moved very slowly, lowering herself until she was at my height. I felt like she could kill me right there. But then she just sniffed me and walked away. "Why?" Derek asked. Mateo looked at him, his eyes teary. "I never knew, but that night I dreamed." "What did you dream about?" The old man trembled and closed his eyes as if he was still afraid of the memories. "I dreamed that she would come back." Derek felt a chill. "And do you think that day has come?" Mateo didn't respond immediately. He just announced himself, went into the house and came back with an old notebook. "That's what I drew when I was a kid." Derek took the notebook and opened it to the last page. His heart almost stopped. The drawing showed exactly the same creature he had seen in images captured in New Mexico. But what really made his blood run cold was the caption written below the drawing, in shaky, childish handwriting. "She's waiting for the right moment." The journey to Springfield, Arizona. It was tense. Derek Holloway, now joined by Ethan Parker and Carolina Mendez, he felt that more and more they were coming from something they shouldn't see. The government was hiding the truth, and the Chupacabra wasn't just a legend. It was a living, breathing threat. Carolina received a tip from a local farmer named Robert Jenkins, who claimed that something had been killing his cattle in recent weeks. But unlike the other cases, he had proof. "This is not the work of coyotes or wolves. I know what I saw," Robert said on the phone. "If you want to know the truth, come quickly. I don't know how long I have until that comes back." Group traveled for hours through the arid desert of Arizona, crossing deserted roads until reaching the isolated farm. The sun was already setting when they finally saw the gnarled wooden gate and the dry field surrounding the property. But something was wrong. The place, it looked abandoned. "Are you sure you're here?" Ethan said, getting out of the car and looking around. "Are you sure you're here?" Ethan said, getting out of the car and looking around. "He confirmed the address this morning," Carolina replied, already holding her camera. The main house had its door open, swaying slightly in the wind. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, just a terrifying void in the air. Derek went first, holding a flashlight. The house was torn apart, as if someone had left in a hurry. Broken dishes on the floor, furniture knocked over, papers scattered. But no sign of a struggle. It was then that Carolina found something on the kitchen table. A recorder turned on. With the tape still playing, she pressed the rewind button and hit play. The recording began with Robert Jenkins's tense voice. "If anyone is listening to this, it means I've been..." The audio was cut off by a strange noise, a hiss of static followed by heavy breathing. Then came a crabbing sound and something being dragged, and then a single sentence whispered in despair, "She's here." A bang came from the nutritious. The three looked at each other, fear clear on their faces. But everyone was looking for answers. We couldn't run away now. Derek took out his gun and Ethan grabbed a flashlight. Slowly, they walked to a huge wooden door which was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. "Is there anyone there?" Ethan called without hope of getting a response. Silence. Carolina took a deep breath and pushed the door. The smell was the first thing that hit the group, iron damp rot. On the dirt floor, there were deep claw marks, as if something had been dragged. Then the flashlight light passed through something, red eyes, glowing in the dark. The creature was there, observing, waiting. And then she moved, quick, like a blur of shadows. Before Derek could raise his gun, the thing was upon them, Carolina clarified. Ethan fell back. Derek snapped. The shot echoed in the night, but when the dust settled, there was nothing. Only silence. Just fear, and the overwhelming feeling that the creature was still there, just playing with them. The silence in the barn was oppressive. The creature was gone, but its presence still didn't feel like static electricity. Carolina, Ethan, and Derek stood frozen for a few seconds, waiting for any further movement, but nothing happened. Just the creak of the wind against the wooden boards and the muffled sound of your own breathing. "She's playing with us," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Derek lowered the gun and looked around. Something told him that that place held more than just traces of the creature. He took a flashlight and shone it into the corners of the barn. It was then that he saw something carved into the wooden beams. Symbols. Ancient symbols, worn out by time, but still visible. "What is that?" Carolina asked, getting closer to take photos. Derek ran his fingers over the reliefs and felt a shiver run down his spine. They were not expected marks. Ethan, who had experience with ancient cultures, narrowed his eyes as he analyzed the drawings. This is not of Christian origin. It seems like something much older. It was then that Carolina found something even more disturbing. A ritualistic circle drawn on the floor, almost erased by dust. And inside it, a metallic object partially buried. She knelt down and began digging with her hands until she pulled out an old iron medallion, rusty, but still recognizable. The symbol engraved on it was identical to the one on the beams of the barn. "I've seen this before," Ethan said, taking the locket and turning it over in his fingers. "This sounds like pre-Columbian magical practices. Sacrifices." Derek frowned. "Are you saying this creature is linked to some kind of ancient ritual?" Ethan agrees. Indigenous people believed that some entities were not just predators, but guardians of portals between worlds. Creatures that protect blood, tributes to maintain the balance between what is seen and what is hidden. Carolina picked up her phone and started searching for similar symbols. What he found made his heart race. "Here!" She turned the screen to the two of them. An ancient inscription found in caves in Mexico. The drawings showed a slender figure with hidden eyes and markings identical to the medallion. But what caught the most attention was the translation of the inscription. He who drinks the blood does not belong to this world. He comes when the covenant is broken. Derek felt a chill run down his spine. Covenant? What pact? Ethan continued reading aloud. It says here that ancient people sealed this creature away centuries ago. But if the seal is broken, she comes back, Carolina added, her voice tremendous. The trio looked at each other. Something at some point had broken that pact. And the Chupa Cabra, it wasn't just an eyesore. It was something much worse. Before we can analyze it all, a sharp sound echoed through the barn. Scratches in the wood circling around them. Something was looking for. And this time I wasn't alone. The silence in the barn was broken by a sound that made Carolina, Ethan, and Derek's blood run cold. Long, slow scratches on the wood, coming from all sides. There's more than one, Derek whispered, squeezing the handle of the gun. They knew they couldn't stay there. They needed reinforcements, and quickly. Carolina joined Derek Holloway, a former hunter who knew the stories about the Chupa Cabra, and put together a team specialized in capturing large predators. If anyone could face that, it was him. You have less than 2 hours. The night is their territory. The plan was clear: lure a creature into a trap and capture it alive. But there was one crucial detail. This thing wasn't just an animal. And if they underestimated their intelligence, they could end up like the others before them. Holloway's team arrived with cutting-edge equipment: motion sensors, thermal cameras, tranquilizer dart guns, and even cages reinforced with titanium. They weren't there to play games. The plan was simple: use a freshly killed body as bait and surround the area with pressure traps, camouflaged electric fences, and steel net capture devices. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, everyone took their positions. The night will begin, the radio hissed. Movement detected to the east. Something big. Everyone looked at each other, holding their breath. One of the thermal cameras captured a tall, slender silhouette moving unnaturally quickly through the trees. Holloway pressed the radio. Secure your positions. Wait for the target to enter the capture zone. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The desert was deadly silent. But then, one of the hunters found on the radio, "There's something behind us." Before they could react, lights flickered and generators failed. And it was at that moment that they understood. A creature knew about the trap. The radio exploded into screeches and screams. 2 men fell. "She is hunting us." Derek ran to one of the observation points and saw the creature's silhouette, walking slowly among the hunters, without fear, as if he were analyzing each one of them. And then, she attacked. In a movement impossible to follow, jumped from a tree directly onto one of the hunters, tearing through his bulletproof vest like it was paper. "Open fire!" Holloway, synchronicity. But the shots passed through the creature as if it were distorting the very reality around it. Desperation took over the team. They weren't hunting the monster was hunting them. Derek and Ethan ran to the nearest vehicle, trying to reset the equipment's systems. This is no ordinary predator. She understood us from the beginning. Carolina was holding a tablet, observing the images from the thermal camera. His face was pale. There's more than one. And it was then that the screams stopped. The night was silent again, but not because the creature had fled. I already had what I wanted, and now they were next. The silence that fell after the massacre in the desert was more terrifying than the screams that preceded it. The wind cut through the sand and the smell of blood hung in the air. A team of hunters has a minimum number of survivors. Derek, Ethan, and Carolina were hiding behind one of the vehicles, watching the shadows move around them. This wasn't a hunt. It was a trap. Carolina whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Derek tried to reactivate the generator while Ethan analyzed the images captured by the thermal cameras. What he saw made his heart race. Oh my God, this can't be real. He enlarged one of the images and saw a strange pattern on the creature's skin. Something that was not natural, something marked, like an inscription. "This isn't just a predator," Derek murmured, analyzing the image. "It is something that was created." Carolina quickly grabbed her tablet and started crossing the images with the documents they found about the government's secret experiments. After a few minutes, his breathing became ragged. Here it is. My God, they knew it all along. She became a canvas for the two men. The document revealed a top-secret program that ran from the 1940s to the 1960s called Project Eclipse. The goal? Creating a hybrid using human DNA and something that was not of this world. They wanted to create the perfect soldier, a predator that didn't need food, that could hunt silently, resistant to fire, bullets. Ethan shook his head in shock, but they failed. Carolina indicated for the last page of the report. They managed to create something, but I can't control it. The creature, whatever it was, escaped from a facility in 1968. The government covered everything up, destroyed documents, and no one ever heard from her again, until the first attacks in Puerto Rico in the 90s. They never managed to capture her again, muttered Derek. I could only watch and hide the truth. But there was one more detail in the documents. Something even more sinister. Among the files, there was a transcription of a field report dated 1951, where a military agent talked to an indigenous shaman in the Amazon. The wise old man had warned, "The military, you accomplished nothing. I only released what should never have been awakened." He talked about Chupa Cabra, Ethan whispered. This was never just an experiment. This is something much older. The penny dropped. The government believed that a creature had been created through genetic manipulation, but the truth was much worse. They just recreated something that had already existed for centuries, something that should never have been disturbed. And now it is multiplying, Carolina said, her voice choked. Derek looked at the horizon. Shadows move. Red eyes glowed in the darkness. They weren't fighting a single creature. They faced a legion. The wind blew hotly across the desert, bringing with it a dead silence. Derek, Ethan, and Carolina knew they had crossed a line of no return. Now they weren't just fighting to survive. They were being hunted, both by the creatures and by those who wanted to keep the secret buried. Ethan was typing frantically on his laptop, trying to send documents and recordings to journalists and trusted contacts. But every time I tried, the internet signal mysteriously disappeared. They are blocking everything, he growled, frustrated. It's not that. Derek moves away from the vehicle window. Someone is coming. The headlights of 3 black SUVs, they appeared on the Earth's road, cutting through the darkness like blades. It cannot be coincidental, Carolina murmured, taking out her phone. No signal. They had nowhere to run. The vehicles surrounded the road, blocking any attempt to escape. The men in suits got out of the cars, armed. It wasn't police. It wasn't the army. Era something. Much worse. One of the men, tall, with gray hair and a gaze as cold as steel, moved slowly, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. You got into where you didn't go astray. The tone was calm, but loaded with threat. The truth needs to be told, Carolina said, keeping her voice firm. The man let out a short laugh. Do you think you are the first to try? This secret has already cost more lives than you imagine. And if you insist, the closest possible will be yours. Ethan clenched his fists, but he knew that I didn't stand a chance against those men. They weren't just agents. It was something more. Derek took a step forward. What did you do? The man stared at him for a moment, then sighed. We tried to correct a mistake that should never have been made. He pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. At the same instant, Ethan's laptop paid. All files have become corrupted. There is no more evidence. Carolina felt her anger rising. Do you think you can just delete everything? Sooner or later, someone will find out. The man moved, standing just inches away from her. And you won't be alive to see it. Before the agents could act, a scream tore through the night. It wasn't human. The agents drew their weapons and turned, pointing toward the desert. The creatures were all there. Red eyes emerged from the shadows. Shit, one of the men whispered. The group leader looked at Derek and the others angrily. You have condemned yourselves, and all of us, the creatures they attacked. It was chaos, screams, gunshots, blood. The agents sought to fight but were caught one by one, dragged into the darkness. And in the middle of the massacre, Derek, Carolina, and Ethan, they ran. They had no more proof. He had no allies. I only knew one thing: the truth could never be erased. And now, it was only a matter of time before the whole world found out. The truck's engine growled loudly as Derek, Ethan, and Carolina were advancing through the desert at high speed. Behind them, the night was alive with screams and gunfire. The men in black were being massacred. Ethan looked in the rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. Slender silhouettes moved too fast, jumping between the rocks, following them. "They are hunting us," he whispered, his voice choked. "So let's find a way to disappear," Derek replied, stepping on the accelerator. The dirt road seemed endless. The GPS didn't work, and they were in unknown territory. The only plan was hide and hope those things lose track. It was Carolina who first saw the abandoned structure at a distance. There, an old gas station. With no better choice, Derek made a sharp turn and threw the truck straight behind the building. They turned off the engine and remained in absolute silence. The gas station was a skeleton of iron and concrete, made by dust and time. Overturned. Shelves, a rusty counter, and dry fuel pumps. The fallen sign still displayed faded letters. "Last stop before the border. If we stay quiet, maybe they'll pass right by." Carolina sighed. Derek and Ethan nodded, retreating to one of the darker corners. The only sound was the rustling of the wind and the heavy breathing of the three. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and then the footsteps began. Outside, something was walking slowly on the sand, dragging steps, cadenced, as if sniffing. Carolina held her breath. Ethan unclenched his fist. Derek pulled out the gun. I knew it wouldn't do any good. The thing stopped on the other side of the stations. Thin wall. They could hear his breathing. And then a deep sound echoed through the empty structure. Scraping of claws against metal. A creature I knew it was there. Despair took over. Derek motioned for them to run, but the moment Carolina took her first step, the station's old lamps flickered. For a brief second, they saw the shadow on the glass of the door. High, skinny, red eyes glowing in the darkness. And then, the light went out completely. The world plunged into absolute darkness. Run. Derek worked. They shot in different directions, stumbling upon destruction. Ethan heard Carolina scream. Derek managed to find her but was pulled back by something invisible. A crushing force threw him against a fallen shelf. The impact caused his vision to be shielded for an instant, and when he opened his eyes, she was there. A creature. Lowered before him, looking at him, studying it. The eyes glowed like live coals. There was no sound, just the overwhelming presence of that thing, watching him in the dark. And then, she opened her mouth, and Derek finally lets go. The creature's voice did not come as a normal sound. It echoed inside his mind. "You broke the seal." Derek tried to scream, but his throat caught. What has been released can no longer be contained. He saw images flashing inside his head. Drained bodies. Ancient civilizations disappearing. The government is trying to control something that should never have been touched. And then, one last view. The world in ruins. The sky made by shadows. Blood flowing like an endless river. A powerful creature at hand. Its sharp claws millimeters from Derek's face. And then, everything went black. When Derek woke up, I was alone. The post was in ruins, as if no one had been there. Ethan and Carolina, they did everything. The only thing left was a single burnt mark on the ground, an ancient symbol, the same one that was in the barn medallion. Derek staggered out of the station, feeling weak, broken. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he knew something inside him was different, and that thing he hadn't yet foreseen with him. The Arizona desert has never felt so empty. Derek Holloway staggered down the dirt road, dust sticking to his face and his eyes burning. He was alone. Ethan and Carolina were missing, but something inside him said that we're still alive. The creature, it doesn't kill them immediately. This meant that it had a purpose, and Derek was determined to find out what it was. With unsteady steps, he follows the tracks left in the sand, thin and long footprints, accompanied by drag marks. With every step she took, the feeling that she was being watched grew. And then, on the horizon, he saw an old, abandoned city, a mining outpost forgotten by time, found in the middle of nowhere. Old wooden buildings creaked in the wind, rusty signs hung from broken doors. It was everything. The last refuge. Oh, last altar. Derek unclenched his fists and entered. The night was strangely silent. No sounds of crickets, no howling of the wind. Just the weight of absolute darkness. And then he heard a suggestion. "Derek?" He turned his body quickly, pointing his flashlight. And there, tied to two wooden columns in the center of the town, square, there were Ethan and Carolina. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. But they were alive. Derek ran towards them. But before he could reach them, he felt the air around him change. The cold took over the ghost town. And then, she appeared. The creature took away the shadows. This time, she was not alone. Through the rooftops, through the narrow alleys, through the darkest corners, other silhouettes appeared. They were everywhere. Derek held his gun but knew that it wouldn't do any good. The main creature, the one that had been chasing them since the beginning, took a step forward. His red eyes burned like red-hot coals. And then she spoke, not with your mouth, but inside his mind. "The seal has been broken, the sacrifice must be made." Derek looked at Ethan and Carolina, desperate. "What sacrifice? What do you want?" The answer came as a dark echo in your mind. "One of you must surrender, or everyone will die." Time seemed to have frozen. Derek looked at his friends. He looked at a creature. He knew. From the moment it all began, he felt he was connected to it somehow, maybe because he saw too much, maybe because he was the final piece of the puzzle. Derek took a deep breath, then took a step forward. "I took it." "No." Carolina, trying to free herself. But it was too late. An advanced creature. Derek felt an icy wave envelop him, an invisible force penetrating his mind. He saw flashes of memory. The first civilizations sacrificing blood to shadow beings. The government trying to imprison something that should never be touched. The ancient seal that he and his friends had unintentionally broken. We know each other. It wasn't just a monster. He was a guardian. And now he took what was due. The last thing Derek saw was Carolina and Ethan's faces, terrified, as the darkness completely consumed him. And then, absolute silence came. When Ethan and Carolina woke up, they were alone. The ghost town was empty. There were no bodies, there were no traces. The only thing left was a symbol drawn in the dust. The same ancient seal symbol. Carolina fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone." Ethan closed his eyes. Derek had saved everyone, but at what cost? They both got up, knowing that I will run away. But one last feeling accompanied them as they left the city. The certainty that somewhere in the darkness, something was still watching them, and that the nightmare was far from over. The dirt road seemed endless as Ethan and Carolina drove away from the ghost town. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, staining the sky with tons of red. But the dawn, it didn't bring about a break. The silence in the car was overwhelming. Derek was euthanized. The creature took him. And now, all that was left was guilt and uncertainty. "We should never have come after this story," Ethan muttered, his eyes fixed on the road. Carolina looked out the window, hugging her own arms. If we hadn't come, we would still be in the dark. And maybe Derek was still alive. The phrase remained paired in the air like a spectrum. They both knew there was no turning back. They discovered the truth. But what would they do with her? Hours later, upon arriving in a small town in New Mexico, Ethan picked up his laptop. I needed to check if I still had any proof of the events. He connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi and opened his files. They were empty. Every recording, every document, every piece of evidence we collected was simply isolated. "This is not possible," he muttered, writing frantically. Carolina moved and looked at the screen. "They erased everything." "No." Ethan swallowed hard, breaking into a cold sweat. That wasn't the government. He opened one of the few files left on the system. A short video. Carolina's heart raced. The video showed Derek filmed on his own laptop just hours before the ambush in the ghost town. He was alone, sitting in the back seat of the truck. His face was tired but determined. If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it out of this alive. His voice was firm but carried with a deep weight. Ethan and Carolina exchanged scared looks. This thing isn't just a predator. It's not just any monstrosity. It's something much older. Something that has always been here. Derek took a deep breath before continuing. We think we can stop her, but we can't stop what never dies. The two watched in absolute silence, feeling a chill creep up their spines. Derek leaned closer to the camera, and then his eyes turned dark. If you think this is over, you are mistaken. The video ended abruptly. Ethan closed the laptop with a snap, his face completely pale. This doesn't make sense. How is this video still here if everything else is gone? Carolina spoke slowly and walked to the hotel room window. The sun was setting. Your reflection in the glass flickered for a brief second. She held her breath. In reflection behind her for just an instant, there was something standing still in the darkness. Red eyes watching. She transformed immediately. Nothing, but the goosebumps on his skin said otherwise. The terror had never ended, and it may never end.